Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hey everybody, welcome to MedTech Speed to Data. Once again, I'm your host, Andy Rogers here. Got a great episode focusing on pharma drug delivery market. I've got two folks on the episode today. First guest, Brent Buchine from Windgap Medical. Brent, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah,
excited to tell your story about Windgap and talk a little bit about the market and pharma drug delivery. So again, thanks for coming on, man. The other guest is Thomas James, Senior Engineer at KeyTech, focusing on the pharma market and drug delivery devices. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be here.
Yep. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. So this is Thomas's first episode for KeyTech. Again, Thomas, appreciate it. And so let's jump right into it. So Brent, our audience consists of global enterprises, startup companies. The theme is speed to data. You know, I think the story, no matter where you are in this market, really resonates with our audience. So we want to start with high level, just understanding, you know, your background and kind of experience that led you to Windgap.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess how far back do you want me to go, right? You know, that's the ultimate question. I could go pretty deep, you know?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe your graduate work.
Sure. Yeah. So graduate work, you know, large. So I'm an engineer by training, worked in material science and engineering, really focused on electronic materials, nanomaterials, composites and things like that kind of early on in my career. As I left graduate school, continued to work in the semiconductor industry, you know, at a couple of startup companies, you know, working in photovoltaics, so solar cells, early in process development, process design, kind of how do you boost efficiencies of solar panels and trying to, you know, nanostructuring to kind of increase performance, light trapping, you know, absorb more light, convert more light into electrons and things like that. As I kind of was leaving that business, I ended up starting my first company. And that company was largely kind of taking all the manufacturing experience that I developed in the semiconductor industry and started translating that into a service type offering where we would kind of help, you know, very small early stage semiconductor technology companies develop their own processes and their own products. So this was kind of thinking at the component level. So very small chips, MEMS devices, kind of at the intersection of microelectronics and kind of nanomaterials, where at the time was really kind of hard to solve for. You know, people were doing a lot of traditional semiconductor manufacturing, but when you take kind of these bottom-up grown structures like carbon nanotubes or silicon nanowires, and how do you connect those things into interesting devices? So started working for a lot of companies, helping them develop their products and a service-based, type business. And then over time, you know, I would say, you know, most of our customers ended up being in biotech, a lot of life sciences companies. Probably maybe 70% of our customer bases were in life sciences, working on microfluidic technologies, diagnostic instruments, things like that. And I think that's what kind of got me that first exposure into the medical side of the industry. And at the time, you know, transitioning from services into products, we were starting to look for problems to solve. And, you know, that's kind of what started Windgap. And then through Windgap, kind of started out as, you know, chief technology officer, really leading a lot of the advanced R&D, you know, technology development. But then that kind of matured over time, and then it really focused on more business development type activities, working with customers, kind of thinking about our pipeline strategy, what kind of products we should be developing, and then how we can partner with pharmaceutical companies to, you know, deliver their medicines.
That's awesome. So you said you're working with Life Sci, with IVD. Drug delivery is a special beast, as we've all come to learn. What led you to drug delivery of the subsectors of medtech, if you will?
Yeah, exactly. It's, especially for someone with my, you know, coming out as an engineer, material science, semiconductors, like how do you make that leap, right? And, I think, you know, so Windgap, if I go back to kind of when Windgap started, we were focused on one very specific therapeutic area, and it was in epinephrine delivery. So anaphylaxis, you know, severe allergies, peanut, shellfish, dairy things like that. You go into anaphylactic shock, and the product at the time, the dominant market leader was EpiPen, which is still out there. And that was the dominant brand. And, we were kind of looking at that market to see if we can come up with kind of disruptive innovation. At the time, we saw a monopolistic market. EpiPen probably was 95% of the market itself. And, outdated technology from the 70s, no real innovation. We saw it as kind of this market opportunity to really be disruptive. And so we started talking to patients and doctors about what some of the problems that they saw with the current technologies and how they could be improved. And actually, if you think about what we did with that, we kind of had this reoccurring theme of shelf life instability, size, portability, ease of use. Really, where we started to innovate was not even on the device side, it was on the formulation. It was all about how can we make more stable formulations of epinephrine, which then created device problems for us to then go and have to solve. So we were kind of connecting the two together. And so that's really kind of how Windgap came to be, was identifying that opportunity and then starting to build a solution for it.
Got it. So just to kind of ask the question more directly, just again for our audience, describe Windgap Medical, your formulation, device company, and maybe while I'm at it, like where did the name Windgap Medical come from?
Oh, wow. That, how much time do we have? That's actually an interesting story. So kind of building off kind of how we got going, because I'll talk about kind of where Windgap got started and what Windgap is today, because we're a very different company today than when we started out. But like I said, we started out with kind of that market need, right? And so what we did was we developed a freeze-dried, basically a lyophilized version of epinephrine to make it more stable. And we wanted to double, if not triple, the shelf life. Right now, EpiPens, liquid formulations, thermally unstable, they expire very quickly. If they're exposed to high heat, they can expire very quickly. And we wanted to make something that was more life compliant. And so what we developed is that lyophilized stable form of epinephrine. And then, as many in drug delivery know, that reconstituting or rehydrating a lyophilized form of anything is an interesting problem to solve, right? For an injectable product, especially in a market where the paradigm is a two-step auto-injector. Pull pin, auto inject. How do you make sure that you can develop a product that's very simple, very easy to use, where you can then automatically rehydrate that dose using device technology versus what we saw the industry was largely doing: multiple steps, multiple vials, lots of shaking, manual swirling, multiple needle changes and things like that in order to administer. Well, if you have a rescue product, emergency use, you're not going to be able to go through all those steps. You have to get it very quickly, and with modest training, you need to make sure that people know how to use the product when something happens, because their life is at risk if it doesn't work. So that's kind of what Windgap became. So building off of that, we started developing dual chamber auto injectors. Understanding kind of from this first market pain point. And then as Windgap matured over time, we continued to interface with various pharmaceutical companies, constantly asking the questions, what are some of the challenges that you're facing in your formulations, in your pipeline? And I would tell you, lyophilized products, suspensions that needed to be mixed, that came up very frequently in conversation. And so as we continue to understand, some of the problems that they were wrestling with in their pipelines, we started developing next generation auto injectors to address more of the same. We also saw that, things like volumes were starting to increase, viscosities were going up, plus the complexities of mixing drugs on demand. Again, trying to stay as close as you can to that paradigm of a two-step auto-injector. How do you do that? And that is Windgap today. So, our device systems are designed to kind of automate the mixing and reconstitution of difficult to mix drugs, whether it be a lyophilized drug or a suspension. We also have dual cartridge systems for sequential delivery. So even if you're co-administering two liquids together, maybe you don't need to mix, but you have two medications that there's some clinical advantage by injecting them together, because we're starting to see that as a trend in our industry as well. And then managing those things of high viscosity, high volume together, and being able to do that actively controlled inside the device are kind of the product solutions that we're developing and offering to the injectables community.
And the name.
The name, right? The name. So how did Windgap come to be? So, all right, taking a few steps back. So the earliest version of our technology. So I mentioned kind of in my background, my experience, my history, worked a lot in MEMS technology, microfluidics. The earliest idea that we had was, can you kind of do microfluidics in reverse? Right now, mostly microfluidics is used for diagnostic applications, but if you need to reconstitute something, can you precisely reconstitute and control that in almost like a microfluidic mixer, where you can run it in reverse, mix something up quickly, automatically, and deliver it? So we don't use it. We're not really, our systems aren't using microfluidics today in that kind of way I'm thinking about it. But at the time, it was kind of inspired. So we looked at, so if you think about dry powder in a microfluidic channel, right? There's things like an arroyo. I don't know if you ever heard the term arroyo, which is basically a dried up riverbed that in a heavy rain turns into a flowing river again. Well, Arroyo Medical was taken. There's another term called a wadi, which we just didn't like. And you kind of get to that point in your own kind of startup development where you say, guys, we got to move on. We got to stop thinking about a name. Let's just pick something. And I kind of found, I was digging around, I was like, a Windgap is kind of similar. It's basically a dried up river that turns into a hiking trail. And we said, look, just let's file the documents. Let's get incorporated. We're done. We can change it later. Right. And just like in kind of same, I think Steve Jobs, Apple had kind of the same kind of comments and how Apple came to be. You never change it. It just becomes part of the company. So that's what inspired it, was this idea that you had this dry, freeze-dried medication in these tiny little microchannels, and that when you reconstitute them, you can quickly turn them into flowing rivers of medication. And that's what kind of got us to the name Windgap.
That is inspired, I guess. So would that imply too that in addition to novel formulation and device development, there at least was a time when you were playing the primary pack game as well?
For sure. And in our earliest devices, we were developing novel primary packaging. And, I mentioned that, reconstitution and portability, size, all of those things were important. And our device for epinephrine delivery is about the size of a roll of quarters. So it's very small, very portable. In order to do that, we kind of understood that you couldn't really rely on some of the standard off-the-shelf packaging. And so we had to kind of deviate. We tried to deviate as little as possible, but we did take on, that challenge as well of some novel primary packaging. And what it enabled is a pretty sophisticated, slick auto-injector that where you simply just by twisting the cap can automatically rehydrate that dose in a couple of seconds, no shaking, no swirling required. And now it's ready to inject in a second step just by pressing the device next to the injection site. So we did get into some of the novel primary packaging. And what we've kind of done since is some of our next generation technology. We have kind of a dual cartridge based system that we've been developing as our second generation platform, really going after some of these bigger markets in biologics and monoclonal antibodies, as well as sustained release injectables. And there we use standard off the shelf kind of cartridges that you'd be more familiar with.
So these are sort of two families of devices within your portfolio at this point.
That's right. And I would say we have probably 4 or 5 different auto-injectors that we're developing. One of them is the epinephrine device, which is pretty purpose-built, specific for epinephrine delivery. And then that kind of more off-the-shelf primary packaging cartridge-based system is kind of spanned into 3 or 4 different auto-injectors using the same kind of core platform technology.
And so that might be like wet or wet dry.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Hey, Brent, real quick for our audience. So do you go to pharma companies and say, what are you trying to inject? Or do you do market research? And like, how do you decide which platforms? Thomas just mentioned there's, the 2 main families. How do you decide, which products to develop basically?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I even try and keep it simpler than that. It's really, we'll talk to pharmaceutical companies, and one of the first questions is, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing in your pipeline right now? And then you just listen. and they talk about all the issues that they're having, and over time you look for that reoccurring theme. One pharma company tells you something and you document it, and another pharma company tells you something, maybe they tell you something different, but eventually over time you look at that data and all of a sudden you see that maybe 6 or 7 or 8 pharma companies are all having similar problems and not finding very good solutions to them. And I think that's what really kind of drove our product strategy, is making sure that we're always kind of listening to what the customer is needing and trying to focus on the stuff that people aren't really paying attention to, right? I think dual chamber, dual cartridge, reconstitution, co-administration of multiple liquids, high viscosity, high volume, I think is something that our industry is certainly understood is kind of been bubbling up as a problem for some time now. But the prevalence of lyophilization, in some of these products, long-acting injectables and suspensions that are being administered, those are, I think, probably one of the fastest growing segments of injectables right now. And so we're trying to pay attention to that and focus on solving those problems specifically, because we think that, there's an opportunity to kind of be best in class in that area.
And I guess follow up on that. I mean, pharma's, in our experience, the device is pretty far down the line of getting a product to market. How do you balance having technologies sort of in the hopper that are just mature enough that they won't be the long pole in the tent when you enter, late stage development, but not over investing in development at the front end, for a device that doesn't yet have, say, development agreements, right? Development at risk.
Yep. Yeah, I think, that's one area that I think I've seen has changed even over time, and how that is even thought about across the pharma company. Typically, a pharmaceutical company would be looking late stage clinic, phase 2 going into phase 3 to start even maybe thinking about a device. I'll tell you, one of the benefits is I think pharma has gotten far more sophisticated in that area. I think there's a far better job of device teams and formulations teams communicating earlier on in the process, early on in the development cycle. We're talking to companies now that are entering phase 1 clinical and already saying, hey, we've got a device challenge here that we need to start thinking about, and bringing the device teams in early. So I think that's really benefited us substantially. And we, a lot of our development is customer sponsored. We are doing things that are funded by our customers, because for us, it's very important to kind of stay connected to that problem. Because I'll tell you, like I said before, we want to understand what the problems are to make sure we're developing the right products. But when pharma is willing to spend money, that you're working on a problem that they need to be solved. And so we try to make sure that we always kind of maintain that connection. And I think the way we've been able to balance it is a combination of trying to moving up further in the development chain earlier on, where in phase 1, and even one asset, a company we're working with, they have a preclinical asset, and we're already starting to do feasibility studies, and they want to send us samples and explore our device technologies to understand which of our products are going to be most suitable for them. And so I think that's a healthy development that's been going on over the last few years that's allowed us to make sure that we, even though we are still maturing technology, that we can mature the technology with our pharmaceutical customers as a partner through that development, even before you get to being commercially ready.
Okay. That makes total sense. Definitely need to, we're seeing more sophistication on the pharma side, and obviously you want to stay close to your customer as you're making those development decisions along with them. I want to stay on track on this episode. So we've done the intro, fantastic, great background. So the podcast called Speed to Data, MedTech Speed to Data. So we're going to jump into the Speed to Data section, and it's usually structured like early days. Our audience wants to kind of understand like what was the data you were looking for to make the decision to jump in, and then kind of where you are today, what you're looking for in the future. So Thomas, got a first question for you.
I guess you spoke to it a bit, but in those early days when you're engaging with, when you identified Epi, right, and started engaging with pharmas and or patients and or HCPs and or family members, what did the data look like that you were, building to make your case to say, yeah, this actually is big enough? The total accessible market of everyone who's ever had an allergic reaction, isn't a very compelling way to cut up the market, right? So what told you that this would be something worth biting off?
Yeah, well, so it was all market research, and kind of getting in front of. So we talk about getting in front of customers. It was all about getting in front of patients. Getting in front of patients, getting in front of doctors, the allergists, the prescribers, even getting in front of payers. The reimbursement side of this, and understanding the problems that they saw in this market. So we had kind of a hypothesis around shelf life and thermal stability and things like that, and portability, but we needed to make sure that we were asking them the right questions. So we did a lot of surveys, a lot of market research, and as we collected that data, and we said, for an epinephrine autoinjector, what are the issues that you see, and then what are the opportunities and the solutions that they would like to see. And so as we kind of did that and kind of uncovered that opportunity, that's what led us to start to design the product that we ended up developing. At the same time, you're correct. I mean, the market itself. So, the number of patients that actually go into anaphylactic shock every year is pretty low. I mean, thank God, right? You don't want to see that. But epinephrine autoinjectors are typically thought of as more like insurance policies, right? I have to carry these things with me every day, just in case something bad happens. I live my life. I try and prevent myself from getting exposed to the allergies that might affect me, but you can't always be perfect, right? And so that's why people carry these things. So the need is pretty substantial. I think at the time, the market itself was about 1.3, maybe $1.4 billion every year of epinephrine autoinjectors that were being filled. But at the same time, and this is where I think the light bulb went off for us, is that was only about 10% of the market need. About 90% of the patients out there weren't getting epinephrine autoinjectors. They weren't getting the prescriptions filled, or weren't even going to the doctor to get prescriptions. And it was that segment that we spent a lot of time talking to say why. Why aren't you carrying this product? And it came back to the features that we described: portability. They're too large. They're bulky. I have it with me and it expires. I've got to replace it every year. You go 2 years without kind of going into anaphylaxis, and you say, what, I'm just going to leave it at home. Eventually you leave it at home enough and you say, I don't really need this. I'm not going to get one. And so there was a vastly underserved market. So what we saw is the potential to increase the market by providing the solutions that we were. And that's where we had a lot of conviction around the business. And so our ability to then kind of communicate that to investors and help them understand the opportunity that was in front of them. If we can take a $1.3 billion business to something that's substantially above that, if we can fill this kind of unmet medical need, that was really the massive opportunity that, we were going after.
Yeah, that's a great story. I hadn't thought about, market research that way. Like you always think to interview people who aren't happy with the product. Well, I mean, effectively that's what you did, but you almost interviewed non-users instead of like users of a product. So I haven't heard that sort of spin on it, but that makes total sense. And then you can, like you said, convince investors that there's a case to be made here. Are you guys commercial or close to commercial right now?
Not yet. We're still working. I mean, so that program is still in development. We're kind of right in the cusp of that DBT phase where we've done all the collection of data to make sure that the device is working the way it needs to be. It is an emergency use autoinjector. So there are FDA, the regulatory requirements, you set a little bit of a higher bar in terms of that reliability testing that you have to do. And so we've already done a lot of the data collection to make sure that the product is going to, meet those reliability needs. Right. And then where we are is we'd have to then go actually collect the data on batches off of our manufacturing line and so forth, and to go through design verification and then eventually validation. And so that's kind of the epinephrine program, but all the other stuff that we're developing, which is a little bit earlier, those other devices that I talked about for larger volume injections, high viscosity, complicated mixing, that technology is still maturing as well. We're still kind of early on in that development where we've gone through multiple generations of those devices. I mean, you know what it's like. You design it, you build it, you break it, you improve upon it, you've work out the kinks, and we've kind of gotten to that point where we feel like we've got most of those kinks worked out, and we're ready to go in and start to think about kind of manufacturing and tooling and so forth with those devices.
Yeah, maybe just a quick tag on that. The dual chamber problem, as you've approached it, is a really big usability lift. So would you say of the kinks, are more of those on the technical, can we get this concept to work, or on the usability, can we get someone to use this concept correctly side?
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably a little bit of both. I mean, once maybe getting someone to appreciate kind of the human factors and the usability of what we can achieve is a little bit easier. Because if you can show someone a 2-step auto injector that can automatically mix the drug and inject it, I mean, it's pretty clear the value proposition of that versus the standard of care today, right? It's a huge improvement. And then you do have to go through kind of the mechanism. I mean, the devices are a little bit more complex than a conventional auto injector that may just be dosing a simple low viscosity liquid, right? Like a 1 ml pre-filled syringe-based auto-injector. And then working through those technical development challenges with your design team and your development team to make sure that you have a product that works well, right? I would say kind of also doing it better we talked about the early Epi device and some of the non-standard primary packaging. We've spent a lot of time talking to pharmaceutical companies about that specific issue, the primary packaging, but not just the primary packaging, the other things that you have to think about, container enclosure integrity and sterility assurance. And we're making sure that we're designing to be compatible with the ways pharma is comfortable manufacturing products, and when do they insert their drug, and how is that filling done, and how is that final device assembly connected together. So we're making sure that we keep our pharma customers as part of that conversation to make sure that what we're developing is something that they feel comfortable has addressed all the risks that they would normally think about in an auto injector development. So I think those are the kind of I wouldn't call them issues because there's nothing. It's just those are the development challenges that we're really focusing on making sure we've addressed early, and that ensures that pharma knows that they have a partner that has a product that is commercially viable at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You've answered like what data are you looking for now it seems as simple as staying close with your pharma customers on like them sharing their drug pipeline and their delivery needs, and when you see those commonalities across multiple potential customers, that's when you guys go to work putting together a product strategy. So I think you've answered my question on like speed to data, today, the data that you're looking for. And I assume you wrap that around like a clear business case and size. So I don't know. I feel like we could pivot to talking more about going forward into the future, what you're looking for. So Thomas, take it away.
Yeah. In the future, what are you seeing as sort of the next big step for drug delivery? There are a bunch of hot words. Some people are talking about digital, some people are talking about sustainability, some people, are talking about multi-med or high dose, high volume. Like, what do you see is the front runner conversation 5 years out?
Well, good question. I mean, I think the reality is it's a combination of all of those things kind of working harmoniously together, right? Because we think about sustainability too, right? It's not just the dual chamber problems that we're solving, but, we're part of that sustainability conversation as we think about our design. We do get questions of kind of connected devices and kind of digital and things like that as well. I think, if Windgap is correct in the way that we've thought about our own kind of product strategy, I think you're going to see a lot more of more complex injectables. I mean, that's kind of the category and how we kind of term this is, this complex injectable category where you have, multiple injections, you have mixing, you have high viscosity, high volume, and you don't just have one of those issues. Because if you have one of those issues, you may have a provider out there or a vendor out there that has a solution. But it's when you have two of these things or three, if I've got high viscosity and mixing and high volume, it's the combination. We see that just fundamentally formulation pipelines are getting more and more challenging, and the conventional options out there are not suitable anymore. anymore. And you have to start thinking about kind of all the complexity of this, and in the context of whether or not, your devices are sustainable and whether or not they're connected. So I think it's really kind of that complex injectables category is that I think is can continue to grow. And I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see far more drug products that are starting to come to market, that have those issues.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we talk to our customers, very rarely are we talking to people about, let's get another 5% of performance out of a incumbent platform, right? It's just, we have a problem that there's nothing out there for. So that definitely echoes what we're seeing from our customers in this space.
Awesome. All right, Brent, we're almost to the end here. We're heading to the lightning round. So maybe I'll kick it off quick. What's an on-market injection platform that you admire? And you got these questions ahead of time. So for our audience.
I did. I have thought about it, but I don't know if I've actually come up with a perfect answer yet. And I think maybe that's the thing that I struggle with.
Or near market.
Yeah. Well, look, but I'll tell you, I think, so if I go back even to EpiPen and you look at the genesis of even where that technology came from, it really started out as in the DoD, right? So Department of Defense, nerve agent, antidotes, things like that. So I look at a lot of the devices that, Meridian Medical had developed way back in the day, that I think those are kind of that's the foundation of our industry. If you look at all the things that we've done since in auto injectors and pen injectors, they're the people that worked on that. Those are the legends of our industry that kind of spawned all of this stuff that we now can go do today, right? So I think I look back at those earliest embodiments of auto injectors and say, like, that started it all, and who knows where it would have been if that need hadn't been there initially. And so I would say that's probably what I admire the most is kind of our history, where we came from. That's allowed us to kind of start to think about it differently as we get more complicated. And now you've got on body systems, you've got all kinds of different injectable products out there, electronic auto injectors that kind of really come from that early, those very early ideas from back in probably the 1970s, 50 years ago.
I guess I'll modify this a little bit given the beginning of the conversation. So what's harder in your opinion, novel formulation, novel device, or novel primary packaging? Since you've done them all.
Oh, yeah. I would probably say novel primary packaging, if you're adding that into the mix, is probably the harder of the two. But I'll say, I don't know if I have a good answer for that either. Novel formulation, novel device. I think, there's all kinds of formulation technologies out there that we're seeing today, especially as people are trying to concentrate drug injections. They're trying to reduce viscosities, address the things that I talked about. You look at some of the permeation enhancers that are out there to kind of inject larger volumes into the subcutaneous tissue, and then some of the interesting device technologies. So I think if you're a chemist, you probably think the device is harder. If you're a mechanical engineer, you probably think the formulation is harder. But I think the hard part, quite frankly, is the intersection of those two things. It's not the formulation, it's not the device, it's bringing those two things together. And that's, I think, why I would say the primary packaging becomes probably the challenge, especially if it's novel, is because that is the intersection. That is where everything meets, and the drug interfaces with the device. So I would say that's probably the more challenging problem to solve.
Very interesting. Very good perspective.
Yeah. All right, next question, lightning round. So, Brent, what advice would you have for entrepreneurs considering getting into the drug delivery market?
I would say, I would suggest do what we did. Talk to your prospective customers, talk to patients, talk to, anybody that's kind of on, is part of that value chain, right? As you think about your product, whether it's the prescribers or even the payers and the reimbursement. Because if you're thinking about one of these, like, you may have this great idea for a patient and the patients are going to love it. But what if you can't get it reimbursed? What if the payer says, I'm not going to pay for that? That becomes a problem. It's really critical that it's a multi-stakeholder problem when you're developing a combination product. It's drug, it's device, it's patient, it's prescriber, it's payer, and you've got to think about all of those stakeholders along your development. So I would say talk to everybody in your value chain and make sure you understand exactly the implications of that on your design and what you're developing so that you have a product that the market is going to adopt.
And I guess last on the list is best barbecue in Austin.
Well, so that's actually probably the hardest question you've asked yet. But I'll tell you my go-to today, I mean, you can always Google and you find Franklin's and La Barbecue and some of the famous ones. Interstellar was my favorite for a very long time until it became famous. It was around the corner for me. And then all of a sudden it gets into the top 10 Texas barbecue and now you can't get in. There's a line everywhere. Oh, wow. So my go-to today is probably Cooper's Barbecue. And then I'll tell you, Styles and Switch is getting a little bit more of my attention, than it used to. So, been going there more frequently as well. Right. So those are probably my top two today.
Well, you have to show us around next time we're in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to have you down. Happy to host you.
Yeah. How often do you go out for barbecue? It's a better question.
Yeah, well, maybe it's better to talk about the times I don't go out for barbecue. That's probably an easier question to answer. But no, it's a staple down here, right? You live in Texas, barbecue, good Tex-Mex, Is there anything else? Do you need anything else, really?
You really don't.
Have those two things. What else do you?
Very good.
It's fun when you get to smoke it yourself, though. We do a little bit of that too. Yeah. So
awesome. Well, Brent, hey, thank you so much for coming on. Thomas, thanks for chiming in as well. Great story. Wish you all the best. I wish you all the best at Windgap. And, it's a long road in developing these platforms. These combination products take a long time to get to market. So it seems like you're going about it the right way with a customer sort of centric approach, coupled with an experienced team and, your technical background. So all the best.
All right. Thank you both. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Rogers. Talk to you later.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.